Welcome, everyone, to the first keynote of the conference. I hope you've enjoyed the session so far. I'm very pleased to introduce Professor Elizabeth Baldwin. Thanks for accepting the invitation to speak at this conference, Liz. Liz is an associate professor at the School of Government and Public Policy at the University of Arizona in the United States. She earned her PhD in 2015 from the School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, Bloomington, where she was a research assistant at the Austrian Workshop on Political Theory and Policy Analysis. She also holds a JD from Indiana University Moores School of Law and a BS in Environmental Policy from Unity College. Her research focuses on environmental governance and natural resource policy, with a specific emphasis on understanding how institutions, in particular legal institutions, shape interactions between governmental and non-governmental actors, including private sector and nonprofit organizations in both the US and sub-Saharan Africa. There's more to her work, of course, but this, in a nutshell, is what I can say right now. Her exciting work has been published widely in leading policy and environmental studies journals. The title of her talk today is a very ambitious one, and I think one that will interest everyone here. Understanding Polycentric Governance, a Research Agenda for Institutional Analysts. So I, for one, am very much looking forward to this, and I'm sure as is everyone here. Before I give the floor to Liz, let me just mention Liz very kindly uploaded her paper to the website, so you can now download it from the usual place. Without further ado, Liz, the floor is yours for about 45 minutes. Thank you.
Great. David, for that generous introduction. It's great to see so many people gathered here for the kickoff of the WINIR Conference. I have a little confession to make. I first learned about this conference back when I was a grad student at the Ostrom Workshop, and I was very impressed that the people who knew about WINIR seemed like the real intellectuals in the room. And so when David reached out to me and asked me if I wanted to give this talk, I got very excited. I thought, oh, this must mean I'm one of the real intellectuals now. So it was a nice moment for me. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's see. Oh, do you all see? Let's see. Do you all see a screen with the title "Understanding Polycentric Governance"? Okay, that's funny. It's not what I see on my end, but I think I can. Make my screens work together here. Okay, so on a more serious note, I've been thinking a lot about polycentric governance over the past few years, and I am really excited to share a few thoughts with you. And before I get started, I just want to take a moment to acknowledge some collaborators. Do you see the acknowledgement slide now? Okay, excellent. So for the past couple of years, I've been working with Andreas Thiel, Mike McGinnis, and Elke Kellner on the paper that I've uploaded to the conference website. My talk today really presents my views, not necessarily those of my collaborators, but my thinking on polycentric governance has been really enriched and influenced by the conversations that we've had, especially during the pandemic for the past couple of years. And a little bit later on in the talk, I'll be presenting a few insights from this literature review that we've been doing, as well as the framework for analysis that we've developed. So if you're interested in the framework, if you're interested in the lit review and you want to learn more than what I give you in this talk, I definitely encourage you to find that paper on the conference website. So I wanted to start out today with a conversation that took place a couple of years ago, actually right at the start of the pandemic during a workshop at Arizona State University, and I was helping to co-organize a session on polycentric governance. And at the time, I was really beginning to realize the research community on polycentric governance has produced a lot of excellent case studies that have a great amount of internal validity for helping us understand how polycentricity works and is it working well in individual contexts. And I put myself in this camp. I've contributed to that literature, but we don't yet seem to have reached the point where we're connecting the dots between these cases and really beginning to understand and tease out why polycentric governance seems to work so well in some contexts and is so maladaptive in others. And I'd also, as David mentioned, I'd spent time as a graduate student at the Ostrom Workshop, and I just had this tremendous amount of respect for the way that this research community was able to attack questions about governing the commons from a wide range of disciplinary perspectives, leading to the generation of these valuable generalizable design principles for long-term sustainable resource governance and use of common pool resources. I thought that it might be very fruitful to do something similar with polycentric governance, and I arranged this session that included a lot of people who had been around the workshop while the design principles were being developed. And I thought maybe we can see if we can learn anything from their experiences. How do we take another ambitious research agenda and move it forward? And one of the people in attendance that day was Marco Jansen, and he pointed out something that I had not thought of before, which is that one of the reasons that people were able to accumulate so much knowledge about commons governance was because there was a central and obvious and important question to be answered. And that question is, how do we achieve sustainable use of common pool resources? And he asked me, is there a similar central question for research on polycentric governance? At the time, I think I probably responded with something like, well, the important question is whether and why does polycentric governance work, whether and why is it effective? But almost immediately I saw that was a pretty narrow question and not nearly meaty enough to really motivate an interdisciplinary group of scholars. And the implication, of course, is that polycentric governance is associated with a lot of compelling ideas, but it may take the research community to coalesce around a single strong central research question if we're going to produce really generalizable knowledge about polycentric governance systems. So that was about 2.5 years ago. And since then, I've been spending a lot of time thinking about polycentric governance, and I think I have an answer to Marco, or actually rather 2 answers. So 2 central questions for research on polycentric governance are, first, what kinds of governance arrangements help communities address cross-boundary collective action problems? And when I say cross-boundary collective action problems, I think this will probably be familiar to everybody, but these are collective action problems that are not contained within a single community, ones where you have to span multiple levels of governance or multiple jurisdictional boundaries or sectoral boundaries, or even policy areas in order to address them well. The second question, probably more important, is what kinds of governance arrangements help communities to address these problems in the face of dynamic change? And question 2 is really about adaptive capacity and adaptation. We know that we live in a world where our governance arrangements, especially around natural resources, are strained by changing conditions. We have climate change, we have floods, we have droughts, we have changing demographics, migration, political changes, economic changes that strain our ability to continue to govern natural resources in the ways that we have. And in fact, many of the ways that we have been governing them are imperfect to begin with. So a central theme in polycentric governance literature that I've been reviewing is the idea that polycentricity really should be able to help our governance systems adapt and remain robust and resilient in the face of all of the changes of the 21st century. You'll notice that in posing these questions, I actually don't include the term polycentric governance at all. That's quite deliberate on my part. Polycentric governance is almost certainly part of the answer to these questions. But I found that I'm increasingly dissatisfied with simply saying polycentric governance is the answer. It just does not get us very far, because my review of the literature tells me that polycentric governance arrangements sometimes work well, sometimes they're maladaptive. They take many forms. You might in fact say that polycentric governance is necessary but not sufficient for adaptation to dynamic change. So we sometimes talk about polycentric governance as if it describes a single approach to governance. We contrast it with top-down approaches. We talk about multiple decision centers. But in fact, there are probably an infinite array of different governance arrangements that could be called polycentric. And a lot of different ways to allocate authority across a wide range of decision centers, a lot of different institutional arrangements for arranging coordination between those decision centers. And adaptive capacity probably requires not just that a governance arrangement is considered polycentric, but also that it should be polycentric in a way that fits with the underlying collective action dilemma and includes mechanisms for change over time. Okay. So before we go any further, I've been talking a lot about polycentric governance, but I haven't defined it yet. David did out me as a lawyer, and anybody who's spent time with lawyers know we like to define things. I actually have spent a lot of time debating folks' definitions of polycentric governance, and maybe we could say, rather than defining it, I'm going to just talk through some of the concepts associated with this term that I think are really important. And of course, I have to start with Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, 1961. This is a seminal article. It provides a basic, at least, description of what Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren called a polycentric political system, which includes multiple decision centers. These decision centers should be formally independent. They should be autonomous, but they are going to have overlapping authority either over subject matters or over geographic areas. That means they're interdependent. What one does affects another. And so we've got interdependence, even though we have independence. There's going to be some institutional diversity, this idea that along with interdependence and overlap, there's probably coordination between decision centers. I don't think Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren used the term institutional diversity, but we certainly use it now to indicate that we're coordinating in ways that could be cooperative, could be competitive, could be around conflict and conflict resolution, but there would be a diverse range of processes for coordination. And I also said that these systems need to operate within an overarching system of rules. And when Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren introduced this description, they were thinking about a particular kind of collective action problem, public goods provision within major metropolitan areas, so places that have maybe one large city and several small suburbs. How do you provide public goods and services efficiently and effectively when there may be a lot of variation across the city and the suburbs about citizens' preferences and citizens' needs and what kinds of goods and services are needed? At the time that they were writing, there was an untested assumption that service provision will work best if it is centralized and consolidated with a single approach to service provision throughout the entire area, and Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren really. I've actually put together a little figure. I'm big into trying to use figures to understand polycentric governance. I think, I don't know how well I can actually channel Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, but this is my attempt, so apologize to those of you who may see things that I miss. But let's just imagine we've got a large city, C, and it's surrounded by smaller suburbs, A and B. And let's just say each of those cities has schools. And these cities may decide to compete. They're going to pay attention to what each other are doing, and they're going to compete to provide the best schools to citizens. Maybe also, two cities have emergency response systems. City C, which is big, is going to have a bigger and more capable emergency response system. City B has a smaller one. City A maybe doesn't have one at all. You can imagine that this might create conflict over who's going to be responsible when there's an emergency in City A and somebody in City A calls 911, who is going to respond, and there could be conflict over who provides those services. We can also imagine that these cities join together to form a regional water district where they engage in cooperation over water quality. So this is more or less polycentricity, sort of as it's laid out in Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren. There's this idea this entire system is operating within an overarching system of rules, sort of common political system, a common system of taxation and property rights that all these cities operate in, and they're engaging each other in multiple ways. And the theory is that this should lead to efficient and effective public goods provision that meet the diverse needs of citizens in this city. For Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, I want to emphasize this was an empirical question. I think that they believed that this would be the result, but this was an empirical question. If we set up a system like this, will we see efficient goods provision? And this basic concept, articulated by Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, continues to resonate today. A lot of the papers that I've been reviewing as part of the Lit Review continue to define polycentric governance with reference to these concepts, and including multiple decision centers and overlapping authority, diverse institutional arrangements. And this question about whether this in fact empirically produces a functioning system remains an important empirical one. But the concept of polycentric governance packs a bigger punch than this. So I want to turn next to Elinor Ostrom's design principles. The design principles don't mention polycentric governance explicitly, but design principle number 8 evokes it implicitly, if not explicitly, saying one of the design principles for sustainable use of common pool resources is that you have to build responsibility for governing the common resource in nested tiers from the lowest level up to the entire interconnected system. So again, I'll introduce a few graphics. This one is quite simple. We start with a community. Oh, I think I went too far. Too far? Yeah. Let's start with a community-based water governance system that is organized using Ostrom's design principles. You might imagine then that that water governance system needs to be nested somehow within watershed-based governance. And again, that governance system should be nested within river basin-wide based governance. The design principle doesn't explicitly reference coordination mechanisms, but we might assume that there would be some sort of mechanisms for coordinating and aligning activities around these different sort of nested tiers. And that again, this is going to lead to long-term sustainable resource use. This adds some really important concepts to our understanding of polycentric governance. First, this applies the basic idea of polycentric governance to a really different type of collective action problem. Rather than service provision, we're now talking about how to resolve the so-called tragedy of the commons. And unlike Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, which really focused on horizontal coordination between adjacent jurisdictions, this design principle introduces the idea of nestedness vertically across levels of governance. So what we might call vertical coordination. And by making this a design principle, really saying that vertical coordination is critical for long-term sustainable use of common pool resources. In fact, for commons collective action dilemmas, the design principles suggest that solutions to collective action problems really need to originate at the community level, where people are closest to the resource, develop rules about its use, but that this local self-governance needs to be coordinated with higher governance levels that have resources and capabilities to enforce property rights, to respect communities' right to self-organize, maybe to provide capacity building, conflict resolution mechanisms, and other things that would not be available to local communities. Okay, so far we've really talked about polycentric governance mainly as a way to resolve two types of collective action problems, public service provision being the first and sustainable use of common pool resources the second. But the literature has developed, a lot of people have really begun to theorize that one of the most beneficial aspects of polycentric governance would be its ability to improve adaptive capacity in a system. That in the face of dynamic change or exogenous shock, that polycentric governance systems should be capable of adapting in ways that ensure that public goods provision is not disrupted or that common pool resource use continues to be sustainable. And here, I think one of the best sort of summaries of this comes from Carlisle and Gribby, together this theoretical model for the commons, and they say polycentric governance systems are better able to adapt when faced with social and environmental change. They provide good institutional fit for complex natural resource systems, and they mitigate the risk of institutional failure and resource losses on account of their redundant teams of decision makers employing diverse or redundant institutions. And Carlisle and Gribby, I think, said it most concisely, but if you look at the literature on polycentric governance, you see these ideas asserted repeatedly throughout the literature. I thought I would try to see if I could model what this would look like. So I decided to take this back to Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren's municipal governance. And I thought, you know, how might we create a little visual model of this? Let's suppose there's an exogenous shock like a public health emergency. The theory on polycentric governance might suggest, since we've got independent cities with ability to devise their own rules, maybe city A comes up with some kind of public health innovation. And that public health innovation, if it works really well, it might spread to city B, it might spread to city C, and that is going to improve everybody's capacity to adapt to this kind of public health shock because we've got experimentation. The literature also talks about another possible mechanism, which is redundancy in the system. So city B and city C, they have their emergency response systems. City A does not have an emergency response system. The fact that we've got redundant emergency response public services in this system means that there's some redundancy. If something happens to city B, they can rely on city A's emergency response services. And one thing that I should note here, part of my disciplinary background is in public administration, and when I first started learning about this aspect of polycentric governance, it just ran at odds with what I was taught. In public administration, we're taught that redundancy is inefficient. In polycentric governance theory, redundancy is something that protects us. If something fails, if one of these redundant elements fails, then the entire system doesn't collapse. And for me, this is a really important empirical question to understand. Why do we have these two different perspectives, and empirically, which ones seem to actually have the most validity for the kinds of problems that this research community is interested in? Okay. The last point that I want to make about polycentric governance as a concept is that while it originated in studies of local service provision and local community-based resource governance, I think that the language and the vocabulary of polycentric governance really helps policy analysts describe real-world phenomena that exist in the 21st century. Even if we don't think a system is polycentric per se, there have been a number of trends that make this set of ideas and this set of vocabulary very helpful. In the US and many other industrialized countries, we've seen a shift away from centralized approaches to service provision towards service provision funded by the federal government, and that did at the local level using mechanisms like contracting out with the private and nonprofit sectors. And the language of polycentricity feels a lot more appropriate to describe these relationships than the old top-down models that I was given as a graduate student. In many developing countries, we see a different version of this story, where countries that inherited highly centralized colonial era governance regimes have started to devolve authority to the local level. And then with global problems like climate change, we tried a more centralized approach under the Kyoto Protocol, and it proved politically unworkable and has since been replaced with the more polycentric Paris Agreement. And so with some of these things, devolution of authority and contracting out and global climate governance, you may not necessarily say, oh, all of those systems really meet our definition of polycentric governance, but polycentric governance somehow describes them in a way that our prior centralized models do not. So now we've gone over some of the basic conceptual foundations of polycentric governance. I want to talk just a little bit about the empirical literature. I mentioned at the start of this talk that my collaborators and I have been engaged in a systematic review of the empirical literature. And I posted that paper to the conference website. It's a work in progress, so I'm definitely interested in hearing what folks think about it. Anyone who's interested in the full overview of our methods and our findings and the research gaps, I encourage you to look at the paper, but I want to touch here on things that I call surprises in the literature that hint at some of the gaps and persistent questions about how polycentric governance works in practice. So surprise number one, this is not going to be a surprise to everybody in the room. It did surprise me. Polycentric governance reforms sometimes undermine rather than support local self-governance. Polycentric governance and self-governance are often seen as almost synonymous by people in the literature. But in the articles we reviewed, there are multiple instances of donor-funded, especially donor-funded resource governance initiatives in less industrialized countries that involve the creation of new decision centers designed to coordinate with one another and with the central government. And in, I think, each case of this that we saw, outsiders imposing a new polycentric governance system, these new decision centers tended to undermine local communities' ability to self-govern. The best documented example of this, I think, comes from Rebecca Gruby's work on marine governance in Palau, where reforms introduced by donors definitely made the system more polycentric according to the Ostrom, Tibu, and Warren definition, but tended to undermine the ability of local fishers who traditionally had had autonomy over how they engaged in fishing in Palau. In fact, Rebecca Gruby has a great paper that makes the point that the pathway to polycentricity matters because top-down reforms can have this eroding effect. And there are a few other studies that I reviewed that echoed really similar themes. This idea that really when donors and people outside the system create new decision centers, they're thinking about creating decision centers that are legible to them, not necessarily legible to local communities. And these findings echo the work of Jesse Ribo and others who have issued these cautions that just because we call a governance system participatory or polycentric, this doesn't necessarily mean that those systems actually give local communities a lot of direct authority. Surprise number 2. This surprised me quite a lot. We actually don't know that much about whether polycentric governance systems fit their social and ecological context. So studies often discuss the governance arrangements at play at great length, but they tended to spend very little time discussing the underlying collective action dilemma that the governance system was meant to address, or discussing whether the way that authority is allocated in a system is a reasonably good fit with the underlying social ecological dilemma at hand. And I think, as I've already hinted with the figures that I've provided in this talk so far, you can have governance systems that look polycentric, but they can appear quite different. And depending on whether the system is one that really requires more coordination across jurisdictions at the same level of governance, it might be appropriate to have a more horizontal system of polycentric governance. If the collective action problem really requires resolving coordination across multiple levels, we might expect to see something that looks a little bit more vertical. And theoretically, we expect that effective polycentric governance systems should fit well with the underlying nature of the collective action problem. But very few studies really attempted to explore institutional fit in a rigorous way. And I think and I hope that my examples of horizontal and vertical polycentric governance really are just scratching the surface, that there's a lot more digging that could be done to think about how is authority allocated, what are the different roles that different actors take on, and is that a good fit for resolving the underlying collective action problem. Okay, surprise number 3 was about adaptive capacity, which I would call the most important and least measured aspect of polycentric governance. I've been reviewing a lot of studies. I'm not entirely sure that I know what adaptive capacity means. I think it might mean a lot of things. Many of the studies that I reviewed talked about adaptive capacity or posed research questions about adaptive capacity, but very few of them seemed to define adaptive capacity, observe it, or measure it. And I think I was talking with one of the presenters in an earlier session about exactly this question. In his presentation, he'd said, it's very hard to observe and measure adaptation. And I think for all of us, this remains a little bit of a holy grail. We have this idea that polycentric governance should improve adaptive capacity. We have some ideas about what that might look like, but it's very hard to observe it in practice and be able to say, yes, I see in this governance system that it is adapting, or no, I don't see good adaptation in the system. There are a few studies that do this very well. Most of them really don't. And I think one of the reasons for this paradox is that it's very hard to measure adaptation or observe adaptation in the kinds of timeframes that we typically have for empirical research. So my own work on polycentric water governance in Kenya illustrates this point, and I'll come back to it in a few slides. My collaborators and I, we studied reforms in Kenya's water governance system. We concluded that these reforms seem to be doing a pretty good job of addressing a collective action problem on water allocation. But we had about 5 years to complete our study. And to really figure out, is the system adapting well to the challenges of climate change? We would have needed to observe it post-reform. How does it respond to an exogenous shock like a drought? And that didn't happen during the years of our study. So we never quite had the longer-term perspective that I think it would have taken. We also didn't have some of the vocabulary that I'm hoping the framework that my colleagues and I are putting together would provide. Okay, so at this point, I think I want to introduce you to the framework. A reasonable question to ask would be, why do we even need a framework for research on polycentric governance? We've got a lot of frameworks already. Many of them are very excellent. This framework calls attention to aspects of polycentricity that we see as understudied in the literature. And it aims to improve our ability to compare across cases in ways that I don't think existing frameworks do. And with that, I'll go ahead and I'll introduce you to the framework, and I'll show you how it might be useful by using it to illustrate some of my own work. We call this the COOF framework. We probably wouldn't be legit members of this community if we didn't have an extremely awkward acronym. COOF here stands for Context, Operations, Outcomes, and Feedbacks. And I'll just start here with contextual characteristics. You may recognize the fingerprints of the IAD framework here, attributes of the core social ecological challenge, attributes of actors and communities, and constitutional level institutions. These are the things that we think are important parts of the underlying context. What are the political systems? How is land tenure, property rights located and enforced? And the reason that we emphasize this is that a lot of studies we reviewed surprisingly didn't talk that much about context. Maybe if the polycentric governance system wasn't working well, they would go back and they would say, these are the contextual factors that undermine its effectiveness. But we didn't really see a systematic, let's talk about the context first and the underlying social ecological dilemma. Most studies did not do that. Okay. Next, governance arrangements. This would be the operations portion of the COOF framework. And here we rely quite a lot on the Ostrom, Tubu, and Warren elements. So governance arrangements here, these would include structural elements like the decision centers, the operational level institutions that determine who can participate and how are they linked, how is their authority overlapping, as well as the governance processes that enable coordination between these decision centers, cooperation and competition, and maybe even coercion if there are hierarchical arrangements. These governance arrangements will lead to outcomes. Here I've conceptualized this in terms of resolution or failure to resolve collective action problems and stakeholders' perceptions of those outcomes. Those are very important. And the literature, I would say, in general, has focused on assessing the relationship between governance arrangements and outcomes very well. What it hasn't done well, and this is, I would say, the real innovation of our framework, is say there are feedback mechanisms. People experience outcomes of governance arrangements in ways that prompt change to the system. And maybe if we break that down into its component pieces, we could learn more about how polycentric and other governance systems adapt and evolve and change over time. We've identified here 3 feedback mechanisms. The first is the idea that outcomes, governance outcomes, might actually produce changes to the underlying context governance arrangements. If we resolve a collective action problem and start allocating water more equitably, that's actually going to make some changes to the core social ecological challenge, the attributes of communities, and so on. But also we think that actors may observe outcomes, and this could lead them to engage in at least 2 behaviors. One would be deliberate reform, reshaping, saying we're going to pass a new law, we're going to create a new program, we are going to in some way modify either the institutional contexts or the governance arrangements in a deliberate way. And the other would be a little bit more of an evolutionary way, reshaping context governance arrangements through exit, voice, self-organization. Maybe somebody who's been involved in the system, they're going to look at what they gained from it last time and say, we're going to operate in a different way than we did. We're going to enter the system, we're going to exit the system, we're going to change the way we interact with other actors. That's a little snapshot of the framework. And I'll very briefly apply it to my case of Kenyan water reform. Anybody who's interested in learning more about this specific case, I encourage you to take a look at some of my papers. I'm going to go through it not in a great level of detail, but I studied water reform in Kenya. The context there was water allocation in a semi-arid region. Upstream users tended to get more water than downstream users. So if water was scarce, the downstream users were largely out of luck, produced a lot of conflict. There was a socioeconomic gradient where the upstream users also had more education and capacity, and this hierarchical permit system that was just an utter failure at the time reforms occurred. The polycentric reform system created a set of governance arrangements that included a lot of horizontal coordination between different groups of water users and a lot of vertical coordination, the creation of water resource users associations as a go-between between local community water projects and national water regulators. And it produced these outcomes that I think were pretty valuable. Reduced conflicts, more equitable water allocation. Colleagues of mine on the project actually interviewed households, and it was kind of funny. Upstream households generally said these reforms were terrible, we get less water than we used to. Downstream users generally said these reforms are great, we get a lot more water than we used to, which suggests to me that maybe the collective action problem is being resolved, even if not everybody is happy with the way that it is resolved. And I think we did a pretty good job of assessing how did the governance arrangements fit the underlying context and how did they help resolve the collective action problem. Oh, I apologize, you guys. I realized that I wasn't advancing the slides, so this takes you, kind of catches you up a little bit there. We didn't have this framework at the time that we were doing this research, and we didn't really observe this system for long enough to find out how did it change. And so I have a lot of question marks here. I don't think that we did a good job of saying long-term, did these reforms improve adaptive capacity? Because we weren't asking the questions and we weren't observing the system for long enough. So did Kenya's polycentric water reform improve long-term adaptive capacity? I don't know. I would like to direct myself to answer some of these questions. Again, over time, how did the actors in the system respond to these changes over time? So this will lead me really to my last few thoughts. The questions that we have been asking in the literature that I've reviewed, these are two of the more common questions. People have been asking, is the system I'm studying polycentric? And was this polycentric system effective? And these are important questions. I would argue that we should be asking the questions that I posed at the beginning of this talk. What kinds of governance arrangements help communities address cross-boundary collective action problems? And what kinds of governance arrangements help communities continue to address these problems in the face of dynamic change? And so I would put forth the following research agenda. Questions about the role of context in the emergence of polycentric governance. Does it matter if polycentric governance is introduced in a top-down or a bottom-up way? How does that affect the way governance systems are actually arranged? How does that affect the fit between underlying problems and governance arrangements? Is that an explanatory factor? Questions about whether collective action is resolved, outcomes produced. I've highlighted this in red because I think the literature is already has a pretty good head start on answering this kind of question, somewhat to the exclusion of the others. Questions about feedback mechanisms that drive change in systems. I suspect that the three we've identified in the framework may only be scratching the surface, and that there might be a lot of different ways that we could think about governance systems introducing feedbacks so that people affected by problems observe the way they are affected by problems, and that they have mechanisms to modify governance systems in response. And questions about how governance arrangements change and adapt over time, especially in response to exogenous shocks, which of course will require us to take a different and longer time frame in our research, and that has its own logistical challenges. So final concluding thoughts here. 21st century is posing a lot of challenges to our social ecological systems. We see them. There's a critical need to understand how to build governance systems that adapt to these challenges. We need more empirical research to understand how systems adapt to dynamic change over time. We need institutional analysts to be part of this conversation. The literature on polycentric governance gives us a very rich vocabulary to study adaptation over time. And it's time to really mobilize these concepts empirically in a way that we have not. And I think with that, I will end it and open it up for questions.
Thank you very much, Liz. That was really riveting. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this. The floor is now open. We have quite a bit of time for a discussion, questions, comments. I see Dan already has a question, and we'll follow with Dimitri. Dan, the floor is yours.
Okay, hi everybody. Hi Liz. I was thinking about this issue of adaptive capacity that you raised earlier, and I have a couple thoughts in different directions. You might look at relating it to Doug North's conception of adaptive efficiency as something that's separate from allocative efficiency or dynamic efficiency in production. I think you'll find a useful relation there. Empirically, you might take a look at adaptive management, say in the U.S. Forest Service, and how effective that's been, how polycentric is that kind of system. I know, J.B. Rule's been working on these kinds of issues for a long time. Just a couple of suggestions there.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. Those are great suggestions.
Dimitri?
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, for a very enlightening presentation and talk. I need to limit myself. I wrote down so many questions, but I will limit myself to one related to the same issue. It was a surprise for me that you mentioned it in passing that design, when you gave a definition of polycentricity using the Thibault, Warren, and Ostrom's paper, then you said that design principles with which Ostrom came up later on are not directly or explicitly applicable, or maybe I misunderstood, and then you just focused on the eighth principle about the nested enterprise. But actually, Eleanor Ostrom herself explicitly connected the two, in particular in Understanding Institutional Diversity book in the final chapter. So she didn't see the. I'm not challenging you that there is that you are not right, but it seems that she didn't see the problem of adopting the design principles to think about polycentricity and what will, if the design principles are satisfied, therefore the polycentric system will more likely will be robust. This what puzzled me, and this first thing. And the second one is, you also mentioned this as a first surprise, of three surprises you emphasized. Whether polycentricity in some instances can undermine local self-governance. That obviously raises the question, are the two synonymous or not? So can you draw conceptually a difference between local self-governance and polycentricity and how they are related?
Yeah. So to the first point, you're 100% right. I mean, Eleanor Ostrom in so many ways connected the design principles with polycentricity. I was just making the point that the design principles don't use that specific term explicitly. And I think people turn to the Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren definition because it includes the term explicitly, but you're 100% right. Though they're very much part and parcel. So sorry if I confused there. I think the second, I think it may be definitional. I think this is my impression. People have been using that Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren definition, and they've been really focused on structural aspects. Study after study after study will say, oh, we're using the Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren definition, multiple decision centers, institutional diversity, and then they'll kind of say, this is polycentric because there are multiple decision centers, and they'll stop there. And so, I think that to your second question, it's kind of a definitional matter. If you define polycentricity to include local self-governance, then some of the systems that people have said, hey, this looks like it's polycentric. They created a whole bunch of new institutional arrangements. It's multi-level. There's a lot of coordination. Those may not be facilitating local self-governance unless they are designed to. And I think even more than the definitional aspect, it points to this challenge that if you have people from outside designing a system top-down, they're going to design it in a different way than people who are at the bottom working on it. And I will just, one quick thing to add, I didn't find that in the Kenyan case. Kenya is in the global south. That polycentric system was designed by a water lawyer who had read Eleanor Ostrom's work, and he was an insider, so it wasn't something imposed from outside the country. So maybe that's part of the difference there.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. Dimitri, I'm sure you'll come back with more questions, right? All right, so if anyone else with comments or questions, perhaps?
Yeah, I have a comment or a question,
All
David.
right, David.
Sorry, I've lost my reaction thing. I really, well, first of all, thanks for a terrific presentation. And I think it's really significant that you, instead of looking at what kinds of polycentric governance arrangements help to address collective action problems, you've said what kind of governance arrangements. And the reason I think, so my comment is, I think the reason that's so important is you've made this distinction between vertical forms of coordination and horizontal forms of coordination. And Vincent Ostrom in particular took the idea of polycentricity from Michael Polanyi, which is all about a self-governing coordination, spontaneous order coordination. And so I think there's a, it may be that the idea of polycentricity can evolve to include overarching state-enforced rule systems, but that doesn't really fit with how Vincent Ostrom conceived of polycentricity. So for me, there's just a fundamental weakness in the idea of polycentricity, and it just confuses us. And I think the idea of vertical and horizontal coordination is a much richer and more fruitful perspective on governance arrangements.
Yeah, thanks for that. I think I tend to agree with you. I've been in a lot of rooms where we tried really hard to define polycentric governance. And one of the things that became dissatisfying about that, I can speak to my Kenyan case as an example. It goes from being very centralized to becoming polycentric. And I think since I stopped studying it, there have been additional reforms that maybe make it more fragmented and less coordinated. And my interest in that system doesn't turn off or turn on when it matches some definition of polycentric governance, right? My interest in that system is figuring out which of these arrangements seem like they're doing the best job of allocating water in effective ways. And so I think sometimes if we get too hung up on defining what polycentric governance is, we lose sight of this idea that there's a lot of different ways to govern the kinds of problems we're all interested in. And governance is going to change and adapt over time. And we need to be able to embrace what are the governance arrangements and what are they achieving. And I guess maybe I agree now more with Andreas Thiel that polycentric governance can kind of give us a lens or a vocabulary, a set of concepts for better analysis, maybe in addition to actually defining the thing.
Thank you.
Thanks for that, David. Dan?
Yeah, just in response to David's comment a moment ago, it's important to remember, I think, that polycentric systems are not just about coordination, they're also about competition. And it relates back to the Thibault hypothesis, the voting with your feet model in searching out the government services you want. And so if you have multiple overlapping units of governance that provide similar services, that gives choice to the consumers. And the other point is that I don't go too far, I guess, Liz, with Andreas's lens argument, because that's certainly not the way Vincent thought about it, or Lynn for that matter. You know, when she was doing the police study, she wasn't focusing on a lens. She was focusing on actual governance institutions. And she did find ways of measuring more and less polycentric service provision for performance. And I think, based on your own assessment of the Kenya research before, that should be possible to do in the Kenyan situation, right? And so I think, it might be sometimes more convenient for a scholar to forego the hard work and look at polycentricity as just a sort of conceptual lens or something like that. But I think there's a real there in terms of the way governance is structured, and it's important to bear in mind both the coordination and the competition aspects.
Yeah, I think you're right, Dan. That was one of the surprises that I edited out because I only needed 3. Everybody's been studying coordination and cooperation and collaboration in polycentric governance systems. And I don't know if it's because the world is really such a cooperative place, or if that's more interesting and more convenient for empirical researchers to focus on compared to competition, which can be a little harder to observe if it's not happening in an actual marketplace.
Can I just ask a question just in reaction to Dan's comment? So I'm one of those that's often guilty of using polycentricity as a lens, but that's only because I'm ignorant of many governance systems in the real world, because I don't do that kind of work. But I wonder, even though Vincent and Eleanor Ostrom didn't use it as a lens, we can still use it as a lens to reinterpret certain debates, certain things that we think we know about governance structures that we can observe, right? Surely it has a value as a lens as well. I don't know what you think about this, Liz.
Yeah, I guess I'm kind of a big tent sort of academic. I think if something is valuable, then I get behind it. And I think Dan's point is well taken. You can contrast things that look polycentric with things that look centralized, and that can be important to do because they operate on fundamentally different logics. But at the same time, David, to your point, a lot of the things that I study, or I've been studying what I call regulatory embedded collaborative governance. I don't know if what I'm studying, if I would call it polycentric governance. This is sort of like utility regulation, clean energy, sort of collaboratives. I don't know that you could really call it polycentric by any definition, but it's interesting to study. And the people that study regulation only using the vocabulary of top-down governance are never going to see the interesting stuff that I see. So I think that there's value in recognizing polycentricity as a different logic for how governance can operate, as well as a logic for saying, oh, once you see it that way, you might see similar phenomena in lots of settings, even if they're not entirely separate logics of governance. I don't know if that answered your question.
Yeah, it does. I mean, that's what I wanted you to say.
And I think especially in the international context, so I also do work in Sub-Saharan Africa, and there, oh boy, it's very hard from my office here in Arizona to know exactly what's happening in some other part of the world. And I guess, I wouldn't want to stick so heavily to definitions of polycentric governance. You may not actually know whether or not it's polycentric until you get on the ground and start talking to people. And so, there is a little bit of this tension. We define things by their structures, and we can look at that and say, that looks structurally like it might be polycentric. I'm not going to know the full story until I actually go and start talking to people on the ground.
Yeah, I think that's an important point. Anyone wants to chime in on this or raise another issue or comment or question?
I have a comment or a question, if I'm allowed.
Of course, please.
So I take Dan Cole's comment about polycentricity is, it's Ostrom, Vincent Ostrom, going back to Madison's constitutional design for a federal republic, a compound republic. where you balance, you put in place institutional arrangements to balance competing and cooperating dynamics. And of course, there needs to be the conflict resolution process. But I just worry that through the neglect of the vertical coordination, it actually ends up undervaluing the rule of law, which is a power over people social process, and competitive bargaining in terms of Michel's iron law of oligarchy. Competitive bargaining often tends to generate oligarchies, and so I just get this sense that the roots of polycentricity in ideas of Polanyi on spontaneous self-governance, and Ostrom's contrast between monocentric and polycentric forms of governance. For him, a vertical form of governance is a monocentric form of governance. And so I think his contrast between monocentricity and polycentricity is just simply mistaken. And it misleads us. So I think the institutional analysis and development framework does allow us to look at governance arrangements much more broadly. And you picked up the design principle number 8. And if we just drop the idea of I think the idea of polycentricity obviously brings out the it's a different form of governance than private sector command systems and the oligarchical control that they've achieved in partnership with government over society. So polycentricity captures that. But as I say, I think that there are elements of the idea that are seriously misleading. And the idea of vertical coordination or vertical governance, I think, is vertical and horizontal governance are much more fruitful as ways of addressing the challenges we face.
I think Dan had a response to that.
Dan?
I don't want to hog the place. I do think David has a point. Although it's you can imagine a horizontal axis and a vertical axis, but polycentric governance units are going to be all over the XY chart, right? And so it's really, if you can think about both in the context, I think, of polycentric governance. One common error is people think about polycentric systems as being decentralized systems and without a hierarchy, and that is a very important misunderstanding and sometimes mischaracterization of polycentric governance systems. Lynn wrote a very important but often overlooked article with Krister Anderson on the dangers of over decentralization, right? And the point that she made from time to time is that the most polycentric systems are typically failed states.
Right. And, self-governance in general needs at least some support from higher levels of governance. It may not be sort of dictatorial, here's how you manage your resources, but there are definitely roles for a central state that can be supportive of rather than undermining.
Yeah, and there's in Ostrom, Thibault, and Warren, it's not really just implicit, they're almost explicit about it, but the principle of subsidiarity, which comes from all places from the Catholic Church. The idea is that you should try to deal with a problem at the lowest workable level for the problem, right? Where no externalities essentially remain after you've treated the problem. And so under that sort of implicit principle, then you see that they talked about the need for gargantua, which in their article represented the entire municipality, municipal level governance. Like a port authority can't be handled by a neighborhood or even by a single city necessarily if you're in an urban area that's municipal. And so it's a matter of getting good governance, the governance scale right, as well as competition and coordination issues.
Dimitri?
Thank you. If you allow, I will move slightly to a different aspect of the talk, although that was a very interesting discussion. Elizabeth, your framework assume there's a constitutive part of your framework is the evaluation of the outcomes. And this is something, doing my own research, I find the most difficult usually, how to evaluate, and you raise the issue of selecting the appropriate criteria, whether it's adaptation or something else. So what are your thoughts on an additional problem to this? Is that you need to ensure that you are staying within the range of the comparative institutional analysis, and you have something to compare with. Is it absolute adaptive efficiency, or is in comparison to other non-ideal governance arrangements? And this is something which is quite often lacking in the cases which we study empirically in the field, because governance systems are not the things which are quite often replicated within the setting of the external criteria. So we lose the focus of we compare it to what? And then we are in the trap of saying, okay, it seems that polycentric arrangement here works, but works versus what? So do you have a solution or some thoughts to how we ought to think about evaluating the governance arrangements, even if the issue of the criteria itself is solved?
No, I think that's an excellent point. I mean, we can compare an actual governance system to a hypothetical governance system, and it's never going to be an accurate or fair comparison, right? I think one thing that could be done more of is comparing over time. And for me, this is really where adaptive capacity comes in. At any one moment in time, I mean, my work in Kenya is a perfect case in point. We went in 2013 and we surveyed people, and it seemed like it was pretty great. We didn't go back in 2014 or 2015 or 2016 or 2017. And I think for me to really get a sense of, is this system working? I would want more data points over more years to, in other words, to be able to compare Kenya with itself, pre-reform to post-reform, but even, after the reforms, are we seeing, what are the kind of trends? Obviously, cross-case comparison can work, although, as you note, what is compared to what, it can be hard to find cases that are reasonably comparable. I think those are the two that I would offer. I mean, there's lots of promising research methods like agent-based modeling that may get you out of the need for direct comparison. And, I'm a true dabbler in those. But pre-post and across jurisdictions, I think that those are what you have to do.
Guinevere?
Yeah. Hi. Let me turn my video on. So I just wanted to mention briefly, like you were talking about the lowest workable level and also failed states, and if you decentralize too much. And it was just reminding me of something I was talking about earlier, in an earlier session, which is that, for example, in America, a lot of people would favor states' rights, and they would do it for the idea of decentralization and local self-governance, and can't we keep things, local so that we have better democracy? And that's all theoretically very good, but it depends, because of course some of those states would not want to protect rights. So my thought is just that in addition to the lowest workable level for sort of technical reasons, it might also make sense that you would want an overarching kind of structure for things just like basic human rights, civil rights kind of stuff. And maybe there are other things along those lines that also should be done at a federal level that are less about the practical and more about the sort of ethical or something like that. So I just thought I would raise that. Thank you.
Yeah, and that is so important, and that was not a central theme for Vincent Ostrom, right? But it has become a much more central theme for people who are doing work now. And I'll just offer one example in this. I thought the Kenyan case handled this very well, because they had the same intuition, I think, that you did, that there are places where if you let it all be decided at the local level, and there's one ethnic group that has all the power and another ethnic group that does not, or, you know, women who tend to not be terribly powerful, that you're going to see unfair governance arrangements. And what the Kenyan state did that I thought that very well, I mean, I would love to go and talk to more people. The place that we studied empirically did not have a whole lot of ethnic conflict. So again, I don't really know how this played out in places where ethnic conflict was prevalent. But the Kenyan state said, all right, we'll fund you guys. We'll fund you to form a water resource users association, but you have to have a participatory constitution. You have to give voting rights to all of the people. And, so, again, how does that work out? How are they enforcing it? I don't know, but that was an example of saying, we're going to retain the local decision-making authority, but put in some safeguards so that we know those who are marginalized are going to be less likely to just get trumped. Super important.
Yeah, great. Thank you.
Thank you. Hanoch?
Thanks. That was interesting, very interesting and fascinating. And I have a question that is kind of an outsider's question, but it relates to the previous comment as well, and the discussion about the significance of polycentricity versus kind of vertical and horizontal structure. How is, in your conception, polycentricity different from the just facilitative role of law in a liberal state more generally? So law creates systems like property, all kinds of property, right? Condos, co-ops, blah, blah, blah. Contracts, corporations, all kinds of corporations, all types of corporations. And it allows us to work within them, and its work with respect to them is this kind of background work of creating the infrastructural institutions that facilitate that. That's kind of what happened. What you find at the kind of the end of the hierarchy that just helps you to do that, and that's something that Ostrom also allows. Now, if you kind of agree with me that that's sort of the same thing, then that I think it can clearly also fit with the concern that was just expressed regarding human rights, because the reason why the law should do that is exactly in order to kind of facilitate people's autonomy, human flourishing, whatever, you can fit your whatever liberal value that justifies laws helping that. But that also means that this should be an internal limitation of what those structures can do. And therefore, non-discrimination, non-subordination can need not, and I argue should not, be perceived as external limitations, but rather that something that fits harmoniously with the facilitative role of those institutions that is needed for the commons to flourish.
Well, let's see, two responses to that. I mean, I think, yes, law can create these systems for self-governance, but it can also take them away. So I'm zooming in from Arizona, where we have groundwater shortages, and our state legislature, in its infinite wisdom, has decided that we cannot self-organize into user groups. I mean, we can self-organize into user groups, but any decisions that the user groups make is not going to have legal effect. The states have different views on this and different degrees to which they're willing to actually give that authority to the local level. In Arizona, the legislature, they retain all of it. So yeah, law can facilitate people's ability to generate more polycentric systems or not. I think the other, I don't know, maybe this is a US perspective, but I don't know. I think without a central state safeguarding the rights of minorities, my observation in the US politically over the past couple of years is that's not going to happen automatically unless somebody imposes it. So I may be a little less optimistic about that. I think.
No, I'm actually with you.
Okay.
My argument, I think fits exactly your two responses. So what I was trying to say is that law has to do that,
Yes.
Just like on the flip side is that the reasons why law can legitimately prevent those user groups are only those types of reasons, right? And otherwise, it has to. Now, law oftentimes is obviously bad law. I'm not, obviously.
Yeah.
But that's kind of the role of the law. The role of the law is to facilitate those types of happy commons, as well as to limit that facilitations only to cases that do not involve either subordination or discrimination. And my point was that these two are the two sides of exactly the same coin.
Gotcha. Yes. Yes. So these are perfect examples of why we need law from higher levels of government if we're going to have effective self-governance at the local level. Yeah, 100%.
Thank you. Dan?
Yeah, just to add to that, for Vincent especially, but also for Lynn, all governance, all these governance processes, all the rules, the regular sort of policy rules of the game are always under what they called an overarching set of rules from the constitutional level, right? Which structures how even, right, not just what goes on at the operational level of day-to-day interactions, but at the policy level, where the regular rules of the game are specified. So you need, in all circumstances, that overarching set of rules, and I think that's what Hanak was talking about.
Right. Well, we have time for maybe one last question or comment. If none is forthcoming, Liz, do you want to maybe wrap up with some nugget of wisdom?
I don't know about wisdom, but I feel like it's time to roll up our sleeves. I mean, not that we haven't been rolling up our sleeves and working hard, but I'm pretty cheered. A little bit saddened. I've been doing the slip review. It's taken about 3 years. It's already out of date. I think the literature has already moved on in interesting ways beyond what I've been working on. So we got to get that paper published. But I just really look forward to seeing contributions from this interdisciplinary, diverse research community to maybe bring a little bit more institutional analysis to the study of polycentricity, which I think it very much needs.
Thank you very much. I think that's a very suitable way to bring this keynote to a close. Please join me in thanking Elizabeth Baldwin for a wonderful contribution to this conference and sharing her really exciting research. Thanks all to everyone who was involved in asking questions or comments and just for showing up. Thank you very much.